Hello everybody, we are talking today about something that all of you love, strengths and weaknesses of democracy. Not as a form of governance, but as a concept in abstract, and we will, with Eric, analyze the implementations and the use cases for it.
Awesome. No, real pleased to be here. I'll start with an anecdote that to me I think is illustrative of, at a minimum, that not all democratic processes always go as intended, which is to say I gave a governance design lesson for what was called the Token Engineering Academy now a couple years ago, and boy was one member of the audience far more interested than anyone else. So afterwards, after they stopped recording, I talked to this individual and they said, I'm the head of this large DAO that currently is fairly centrally controlled, and based on a vote with a participation rate of less than 1%, so less than 1% of the token holders even bothered to show up for the vote, they decided that they were going to decentralize the community. And they had a strict timeline under which that was going to occur. And so for me, at a minimum, the foibles of democratic decision-making were fairly revealed in that moment, especially because my initial response was, well, how representative is that 1% of the rest of the people who didn't bother to show up for that vote? Might it be that those who wanted to decentralize to community had either just, preferences that did not represent every last token holder in that particular democratized context, or even worse, were they like the risk-free value raiders saying, wow, yeah, once you decentralize to community, we're going to grab your public treasury and run away with it, immediately liquidating it and probably passing it through some type of mixer and tumbler. And so to me, there are inherent limitations to democratized decision-making in organizational contexts. This is especially the case in private organizational contexts, in great part because there are certain structural differences in private organizational contexts relative to public constitutional orders, from which most people's love of democracy comes. This isn't an anti-democracy talk, though. This is a talk arguing that, like every other institutional design solution, any one such solution, such as democratizing decision-making within a particular organization, is not a panacea. It doesn't work well in every single context. And so for me, I'm going to review a few kind of just what are understood to be either canonical reasons for centralized decision-making in certain contexts, or just simple limitations on democratic decision-making. And I'm going to sort of end with a provocative punchline, which I won't spill the beans about yet. But to me, one of these sort of canonical arguments for one group deciding on behalf of a much larger group, so that's not democratized decision-making where everyone subject to the decision votes on every single decision being made or provides input on every single decision being made. One such example is simply thought of as concentrated incentives. So if board members in particular, board members and executives of a corporation, imagine they are identical to every shareholder in that corporation. Well, then you wouldn't be as worried about agency costs, but the arguments about why a smaller group decides on behalf of a larger group, simple efficiency, which is to say that you economize deeply on attention costs, where if 5 people's time is taken up making day-to-day decisions for an organization, then 95, people, if it's an organization of 100, can go about doing other things, whether it be pursuing that organization's mission in terms of actually producing outputs for that organization, or just living their day-to-day lives. Think about, both voting contexts that you have showed up to participate in, as well as potentially, token votes or other things you didn't actually, you either forgot or you had something more important at that particular moment. And so this is just a simple attention costs argument saying that there are emergent economies in centralizing to some extent among one group the decision-making authority for a broader group. This is thought to be why we delegate representative authority within still pretty darn democratic orders. And imagine if you got a push notification on your phone for every decision being made by the municipality you live in, the state or province you live in, as well as the national government that you also reside in. Wow. Would you be subject to a lot of push notifications? Would you be informed about every single one of those decisions to a sufficient extent that you would make a great decision? I'd like to believe so, but I actually don't in practice, which is simply to say, and for reasons I'm about to get into, not everyone's incentives are to be perfectly informed about every decision to which they are subject. In private governance context, though, there's something additional, which is, and this is often thought to be unfair, why does the CEO get so much benefits from the company's performance over a 5-year period relative to the average shareholder? The argument surrounds concentrated incentives. If they make, say 20% of the benefits, even as the remainder are dispersed to shareholders at a sort of pro rata level, they have a lot of incentives to truly think about every decision. This is what's called concentrated incentives. And so a CEO, they stay up late. They worry about every possible competitor's decisions. And if the incentives were just dispersed across all shareholders, you might have what's known as a tragedy of the commons, which is to say no one has a strong enough incentive to want to show up and make those decisions, to put in the work, to do the due diligence to figure out what the right decision is. And so this is an argument that's labeled concentrated incentives might lead to better outcomes for a particular group than just leaving it up to every last person to have equal input on the decision. If the incentives are sufficiently dispersed, no one actually has a strong enough incentive to put in the due diligence, to put in the time to figure out what the right decision is. This is very related to another criticism of, purely democratized decision-making in organizations, especially private organizations, which is that of specialization and expertise. And the sort of example I use for my students is, do you want to subject to popular vote nuclear safety regulations? So imagine you live near a nuclear power plant. I have no idea the level of engineering, mechanical engineering, both specialization and sort of public health related radiation concerns, the actual risks that we're facing. And so to me, there are some decisions that require a level of specialization that not every group member has, you might be like, look, you could learn that. You could go get a degree. What tends to lead people to specialize to that level? Creating concentrated incentives associated with the application of their expertise. And so whether or not it doesn't require an assumption that no one in the group or not everyone in the group could possibly learn enough to develop the relevant expertise or specialization. But that's costly. So you tend to want to reward that level of effort or attract that level of expertise that not everyone in a particular organization can reliably be expected to have. So at a minimum, there are certain specialized, often hyper-technical decisions, and I think that this is also true on blockchain networks, that there are very, very technical decisions that require a level of specialization that not every group member can understand to a sufficient level in order to be informed and make an informed decision. And there are very interesting trade-offs in public sector contexts between mandating that everyone vote versus allowing people to vote if they choose. And to me, there's a very deep trade-off, which is, at a minimum, everyone that is compelled to vote upon penalty of, a fine or some other form of criminality, at least you get a high participation rate. Because boy, are participation rates in non-mandatory voting contexts, from at least some people's perspective, pretty darn dismal. And so, to me, another sort of canonical criticism of the expression of the democratic will, as it's often called, and we have somebody who specializes in human rights in this audience in particular, but that's to say, without some type of guardrails around the expression of the democratic will, what is to say that it's just, equitable, or even desirable? If 51% of people in a particular community vote to expropriate 20% of the community's property, is that good? I can be even more extreme. What if they vote to just kill someone? Purely representative expression of the democratic will. And no one, I think, would agree with that as something desirable. And so ultimately, you have what are called constitutional guardrails around what in public sector context, the legislature can decide upon. And generally, the legislature can't say, we're passing a bill to take this person's property because we don't like them. Or we're passing a bill to take this person's property or imprison them because they've been criticizing us. Generally, those are not allowable. And how you actually create that outcome is you put guardrails around what the democratic will can decide upon, even in instances where the expression of the democratic will is thought to be desirable or the best we can do. And ultimately, imagine, we had push notifications on our phones associated with particular outcomes. Liquid democracy, as it's sometimes called. I've already mentioned that would be very, very costly from an attention-related perspective, which is simply to say that all of our attention is valuable, as we've certainly come to learn in this digital age. And if all of our attention was consumed, what's the opportunity cost of that? At a minimum, I'd be able to spend less time with my 3-year-old daughter, who I'm currently tremendously enchanted with. You name the opportunity cost. And at some point, having everybody's attention harnessed in order to express that democratic will comes at a cost. And thus there are deep trade-offs to choosing to harness the sort of expression of the democratic will in any particular organizational context. But to me, it gets even more complex. The problem is the reason people don't show up to vote is often their interests are not that implicated by democratic decision-making. And reifying the vote in a single individual has a very, very weird outcome that I think directly leads to the emergence of political parties, the emergence of factions, and the emergence of interest groups, which is some decisions made in democratic orders. I live in the United States. A few decisions made every year affect my interests. The vast majority do not. And so the problem is when we say one person, one vote in these contexts, it reifies in a very weird way the constituent authority that is simply not actually distributionally representative. What do I mean by that? I call this preference heterogeneity. On certain decisions, 1% of the population cares immensely. On other decisions, 10% of the population cares immensely. But think of the evangelicals supposedly holding their nose to vote for Donald Trump. They care about one issue in particular, abortion or women's reproductive rights, depending on your stance on that question. But ultimately, they care so much about that issue that they're willing to vote for somebody who has many undesirable characteristics from their own perspective, from the morals that they profess as being associated with their religious beliefs. For them, that one issue is so important, they're willing to overlook character defects as well as non-representative decisions he's likely to make in other areas with respect to their preferences. And so forcing things to a vote and tying it to an individual ignores preference heterogeneity in very, very weird ways. So how do you get around that? Find a group that says, well, we know you 10% care about this, and we know you other 10% care about this, and we know you other 10% care about this. And if they can aggregate enough of those preferences among one party platform, as it's called, then they might have a winning vote in a particular electoral system. It's especially acute in the United States and other single-member first-past-the-post geographic districts because that converges to two-party systems over time. And so, boy, does a lot get bundled into the two different party platforms that are necessarily emergent because of the choice of voting rule in those specific contexts. But it's still the same in other contexts where you have proportional representation and people tend to vote for a party as opposed to a single candidate. Make no mistake, though, the extent to which people's preferences vary means even those parties in, the coalitions of 5, 7, and past that, it becomes incredibly chaotic and very hard to even reflect the democratic will if you try to broker a coalition of 30 parties. And so for me, preference heterogeneity naturally leads to effectively the emergence of factions within these systems to say, we know you care a lot about this, we know you care a lot about this, and boy, is there a lot of weird horse trading in the background. And so necessarily giving everyone one vote according to whether they have tokens or whether they have, individual identity that a particular polity can say you are a citizen and you're entitled to a vote leads to another interesting outcome. It's called log rolling, or simply political transactions, which is to say that, the farmers in Iowa, they care about government subsidies, insurance against, commodities price fluctuations, bad weather events. They have a set of things that they care deeply about as a function of their chosen livelihood. So their representative in Congress says, this new tech bill that California has pretty strong opinions about, New York has pretty strong opinions about, the government in Washington, the executive agencies have pretty strong opinions about. The representative from Iowa says, I've got a vote that my constituents don't care that much about. So what do? You sell your vote. Of course, it's illegal to do so. But what do we see in practice? It's called log rolling. And so suddenly a bill that has something in the title buried on page 200 guarantees subsidies to Iowa pig farmers. And arguably, if they're performing their representative duty faithfully, they have a property right, a voting right within that system, a decision right, as it's often called in the relevant literature. Why would they give it away? Why would they abstain if they know they can get something for the people that they are representing? But again, attention costs cut towards delegated representative authority in voting systems, and then preference heterogeneity simply means that those who have that delegated authority don't equally care about every decision. And this is acute whether you map it down to the individual level. Those of you who work in agriculture understandably care a lot about crop insurance, about, subsidies in the case of wild price fluctuations in commodities. Naturally, people who work in the, financial district in New York City don't care that much unless their firm happens to be deeply vested in an agricultural conglomerate. And so naturally, if you're granted a decision right over a particular system, the question becomes, what do you do if you don't actually care about an outcome? Either you don't show up, which has consequences I'm about to reference, or you effectively sell your decision on behalf of others. In either case, is that truly representative? Not especially clear, and certainly not especially clear that you get the benefits that are often thought to be, well, we all voted on this decision, so it must equally represent all of us. It's like if you posit sufficient preference heterogeneity, aggregating in such a way that you believe a particular vote reflects the entire community, it's just functionally, it's impossible. You can't actually aggregate, and you have interesting results such as like political cycling and other, storied results from the political science literature. But preference heterogeneity leads to something even, to me, what's considered more insidious, which is that of special interest groups. And so ultimately, if you care more about a decision than the average person in a community, you will show up longer. Your voice will be louder. In the case of politicians in Washington, D.C., you will have a lobbying firm on K Street dedicated to talking to the politicians. If you're an ordinary voter, good luck affording an office on K Street, let alone assembling the level of capital necessary to have fancy lawyers that went to the same law schools as the fancy politicians showing up and talking to them about their interests. And I don't mean to fully pejoritize concentrated incentives. It's the fact that you say, we're going to decide for everyone via this voting regime that creates this problem associated with preference heterogeneity within these complex systems. And it's simply the case that imagine a local factory owner wants to talk to a particular politician. And I've got two characterizations that help make this distinction clear. I think we often unproductively conflate self-interest with corruption. So the local factory owner says to his local politician, if you support this change in the regulatory environment, it will cost 100 jobs in our community. Isn't that something the politician wants to know and should hear about in making a representative decision on behalf of their constituents? But at the same time, pursuant to the point I was making earlier about concentrated incentives, it may well be the case that in addition to losing 100 jobs, that factory owner also loses, 20% of their expected income in that year. Sounds a little bit more corrupt when you frame it that way. But to me, it's subjecting this to a particular sort of voting decision that creates that dilemma every time. And so this has been kind of shown, and a Nobel Prize was awarded for this insight, which is called associated with political economy or public choice theory, which is there are structural incentives for smaller groups that have concentrated benefits and disperse costs across an entire polity. And so those smaller groups, given the concentrated benefits and given the, if you posit non-zero costs on the part of every group member from showing up and trying to obtain those outcomes, the more you disperse the benefits, the less you are able to have a coherent interest group within the system. And so this is thought to be the reason that special interests dominate in democratic decisions. And so this has been, a very, very brief survey of reasons why seemingly one person, one vote can result in suboptimal outcomes. It avoids the ability to give concentrated incentives to a group to do due diligence. It ignores that many group decisions rely on specialization or expertise. The example I gave was your nuclear safety regulations. I'm not sure I want those subject to democratic decision making. Similarly, the exercise of the democratic will, absent guardrails on that, or constitutional limitations, or bills of rights as they're called, that can often lead to unproductive outcomes. I hope none of you would be like, we should be able to vote to kill people. We put that long ago in history, and I'm glad we put aside that form of the expression of the representative democratic will. Similarly, it's very costly vis-a-vis attention costs. The motivating example, imagine a push notification on your phone every time any authority that you're subject to was making a decision. The attention cost would be calamitous. And similarly, preference heterogeneity among group members with respect to every decision both leads to the emergence of factions and political parties within every group, as well as, to me, also is an input to special interest group politics, which I just concluded about. So, dictatorship is cool? Is that my punchline? Not exactly. Instead, I do think, though, if exit costs are sufficiently low, and this is true in many, many private organizational contexts, this is likened as an argument for why we see relatively concentrated decision-making in private organizational contexts. It's called a market for dictators. If consumers of that company's output, if workers for an organization, if voluntary contributors within an organization, if they can leave and go to a competing organization, if they can shop at a different grocery store, if they can buy from a different producer, the people making concentrated decisions in that ecosystem know that. And the only way that they can succeed dynamically is if their decisions actually represent sufficiently the preferences of those who are consuming their output, those who are working for that particular organization. And so ultimately, this is an argument that, hey, if exit costs are sufficiently low, centralized decision makers' scope of decisions is actually meaningfully constrained on the margins because they have to represent a sufficient number of individuals within that particular group in order to dynamically obtain what they're pursuing, whether it be consumer-based, whether it be voluntary contributions within an ecosystem, you name it. Those with concentrated authority facing low enough exit costs for those consuming the output of those decisions, they're meaningfully constrained. This point is not original to me. If you're deeply interested in it, just Google market for dictators, and that it's been well trodden in the literature. And to me, I have a deeper punchline, which is to say, democratic decision-making, as I noted in my introduction, is one institutional specification among many for how you make decisions in complex human groups. But choosing whether it be democratic, whether it be an executive overseen by a board on behalf of many atomistic shareholders, those are kind of the two canonical specifications, and that's what led to the market for dictators in the second case. That is preceded by formally constituting an organization itself. How do you even have voters if you don't say, this is the community, these are the identities within this community? Whether it be tokens or whether it be individuals, as is more traditional in both democratic orders, in either case, you're saying we are formally defining this organization. We are saying these are the citizens, these are the shareholders, these are the token holders, and these are their rights within that system as against those exercising concentrated governance authority. All else equal, I like constraints on the exercise of concentrated governance authority. But there's often this deep fallacy, which is we need to constitute the thing in the first place. Those who like democracy are saying we want everyone to be able to vote in this community. And I'm like, absent having a set of secondary rules, voting looks very weird. It either cycles strategically or it doesn't even really meaningfully obtain if you haven't delineated an entrenched set of secondary rules in the first place. But my question for those of you at ZuVillage, those of you at other pop-up communities is, do you even need to constitute the thing? That's the fundamental act of centralization. That's the fundamental act of exclusion, is saying these people have these voting rights as against these authorities making decisions on their behalf. It is, to some extent, emergent, which is communities naturally have decisions that implicate everyone's interests differently. I was fascinated by this at ZooConnect in particular. I'm looking at the ZooConnect sticker on my phone. Had a wonderful time there, learned a lot about zero-knowledge proofs, kind of blew my mind. But setting aside my love of ZKPs is simply the question emerged, which is where will the next Zuzalu be? And to me, that's essential sort of in the sense of if you want to make a decision on behalf of an entire community, you have to say, this is the authority or authorities that will make that decision. And unfortunately, with those types of decisions, and I've written about this at some length in Governance as Conflict, my earlier talk this week spelled out at length why conflict is emergent among formally constituted human organizations. They have to make decisions that create winners and losers. This is why the special interest groups emerge and lobby the decision and show up longer, because they know if they win the outcome, then they take a lot in terms of, and not necessarily I dislike the construction that motive is always and everywhere corrupt. I think the people that wanted it in Zanzibar actually love that location. Some of them live there. They've chosen to locate their lives and their economic interests at the same time in that particular location. But the problem is choosing one location, whether it be Zanzibar, whether it be this lovely place we are in Georgia, comes at the cost of other locations to the extent you have a formalized organizational shell. But to me, what's particularly interesting is that you may not have to constitute the thing. Constituting the thing poses whether you want it to be democratic, whether you want constrained dictators, whether you want wise councils that can be voted on among token holders or citizens, if you will. But what if you can avoid all of that? And to me, that is what I see as particularly fascinating about this community. That was a key moment that led to, I think, a recognition that that level of centralization of authority required to make a winner-takes-all decision about the next location was sufficiently at odds with some of the animating principles of this community. And so for me, I see it as ZuVillage and the many experiments that have emerged have left things at the level of a very attractive valence, which is to say, these are our principles. Show up voluntarily, contribute voluntarily to the pop-up communities. And so I see it as more akin to kind of like a form of technology that is not unique to any particular instantiation of it. There are many, many different blockchain networks, and even I've encountered pretty widespread disagreement over even the definition of what blockchain is. Does it require distribution of the ledger? Is it just time stamping with hash pointers particular chunks of information, even if they're only, native on one particular ledger? And so for me, I'm like, notwithstanding that, many, many productive coordinative experiments have been born as a result of that animating concept of a technology. And so my characterization of, ZuVillage is it's not a constituted organization. And that may well be a feature, not a bug. Because it remains then an attractive valence that if people are sufficiently attracted by a particular manifestation of it, they show up and they voluntarily contribute. And so in some sense, interestingly, the proof is in the pudding in practice in terms of the extent to which these communities attract voluntary contributors, even as they aren't saying, you're a citizen, you're not a citizen, you vote on the next location, you can't vote on the next location, this wise council makes these decisions and you can vote them out periodically. All of those things come from formally constituting an organizational shell and to some extent centralizing authority within that organizational shell. But I hope I've left you with the recognition that there are trade-offs. And so to me, there are also trade-offs with leaving things undefined. And so to me, this is why in some contexts, constitution of an organization and definition of its authorities and its members subject to that authority is emerging. What's one concern? To me, unconstrained informal dictatorships. And I've studied, a variety of tribal governance contexts. And in some of those cases, I wouldn't consider every outcome to be wonderful because the elders are subject to unconstrained exercise of authority in those communities in certain ways that have been observed to violate what we consider human rights. I think this community has, to me, fairly, uncorruptible leaders that I view very, very positively. But that's a risk that I also want to point out, which is a trade-off associated with exactly this, is the reason you tend to formalize authority within communities is you can then constrain the exercise of that authority dynamically. And so it's not to say it's a universal solution. Another concern is your inherent political economy. People are here for different reasons. I'm here because I believe in the value of governance innovation, of which I consider this community to be an experiment. But why have I been giving so many talks? Not only because I'm grateful to the organizers, so I want you all to read and cite my works. So to say that I'm not self-interested is I'm lying. And so everyone has some, and this is part of why I spelled out the extent to which self-interest isn't inherently corrupt. And to believe that, only altruistic people show up keeps a political economy latent. So that's another risk of not having a formally constituted authority by which people can periodically, vis-a-vis their own perspective, adjudicate outcomes in a, do we recall the wise governors? Do we fund this particular experiment or that particular experiment? But it, to me, is also, to the extent your animating principles are, we don't want centralized authority, and centralized authority breeds both losses if you choose democratic decision-making. That was the essence of the first part of my talk. It also leads to some measure of concentration of governance authority. Constituting a thing is inherently centralizing. So to the extent you believe in voluntary contributions, the spontaneous emergence of many, many sort of, villages inspired by the valence of principles that I see as animating the first ZuVillage, then I think you're making the right decision, but you should be making that decision with eyes wide open vis-a-vis the trade-offs that every governance design choice has for complex human organizations. So for me, there are no universal solutions. Democracy is not a universal solution. It's desirable for certain contexts and not others. Even constituting the thing is not a universal solution. And I think this experiment in particular is fascinating because I think we have the technological tools that mean possibly a different path is viable. But to me, it does depend on the extent to which leaders within this community remain virtuous. And ultimately, there's going to be a latent political economy. Sometimes it surfaces. One person asked Balaji in our Q&A, why didn't you respond to my funding email? And so I'm like, hey, at some point, and again, maybe that was the right time to ask that question. Self-interest is not always and everywhere bad, and we shouldn't deny its existence. And I'm certainly not some sort of virtuous governance expert, other than I want more people to get along and I want more voluntary contributions. And I think that this community is a great experiment in that direction. I've ranted enough. Any questions? How are we doing on time? Oh, yeah.
20 minutes or so.
Chance.
That was great, thank you. Question on that. So, what about in cases where there are, I use this example in Zulu, where there's no formal governance, and I think I love that you've really went on volunteer contribution as kind of a metric to think about. That's one of the things I really love about this. But there are, I'd say probably all of the pop-ups that I've seen, they exist because there's funding that have kind of helped them launch, and that's had to have some central function. And I helped with the first one, others have helped with the second one, and both of those have been very shit shows, a little bit controversial is another way to put it. And I can speak from someone who's doing it was very difficult. You could really see different factionalism and trying to navigate around and all of that. How would you think in that case where there are situations where there's some central functions and experiment with different ways to do it? I'm just curious if you have any thoughts around that.
I mean, first of all, Vitalia was existing before any global ZuVillage funding round was even out there, and it was completely finally planned and sponsored by the longevity industry and not by ZuVillage.
Okay, there's one that doesn't fit that.
No, and to me though, the point you're making is more general, and I guess this is a benefit and a limitation of a comparative lens, which is I don't even know all of the pop-ups. I learned about several that occurred in China as a result of attending this. But the general thing that you're describing is there tends to be a community pool of resources. And I actually view governance as potentially emergent from that reality. It's certainly thought to be the case that at least in the Western world, the constraint or the constraint on effectively unconstrained exercise of sovereign authority is thought to have emerged surrounding a spat between the lords in England and the king. And the shorthand of one of my favorite analyses of this is, so the king welches on all of his debts on the continent of Europe. So all of the independent moneylenders are like, your credit is bad, sir. You haven't paid us back because you, one, live a very, unconstrained life, and two, you've been fighting a very expensive war with France. So the king comes to the lords and says, hey, do you want me to lose the war with France? They're like, no, we've suffered several French invasions to date and would prefer to avoid that outcome. But your word isn't exactly good. You've run up your credit limit with all these other people that we know about that still lend us money because our credit isn't crap. And so they basically brokered an arrangement where they had periodic oversight of the public accounts the monarchic ability to continue fighting a war in France. And so that is thought to be the emergence at a protean level of the rule of law, which was for the first time the sovereign voluntarily bound himself to a different group that had authority over him. And it created an incentive compatible equilibrium precisely because he knew if he was particularly profligate in one period, the lords would all say, we're not renewing your credit card limit next particular period. And so it's both funny, but it literally is not, oh, the rule of law emerged because this one period of time the king was like, I want to bind myself. And it wasn't even the will of the commoner. It was like, I want to keep fighting wars in France, and wow, I can't figure out a way to finance that unless I bind myself credibly to a different group. And the more general lesson, though, is, and this is, to me, there are 5 canonical elements of group decision-making that you have to think through when you're constituting group authority. That is, how do you make a collective decision? Who makes it? Often that's delegated representative authority. Who administers or executes that decision? Do you need ex post review or appeal from any of those decisions, or the execution or administration of those decisions? Those are, to me, deliberately the canonical legislative, executive, and judicial functions. But boy, you should pay attention to who controls the power of the public purse, as it's often called. And so to me, this is the essence I see animating your question, Chance, is follow the money, as it's often more crudely put. But effectively, you should especially watch the allocation of any community-defined funds. And I think some of the public goods funding mechanisms in, the broader blockchain and Web3 ecosystem are, to me, not well designed currently. There's some deep structural problems associated with them. That's not a call out to the ZuVillage community in particular. To be clear, I haven't studied its funding mechanisms at any great length. It's more, that's based in the extent to which one of the most important sort of governance authorities that you can specify surrounds, hey, there's a pot of money for the public good. And I mean, if I were to say public good, define it and define competencies within that, even within this small room of pretty darn like-minded individuals, I bet I would find room for disagreement over exactly that question. Which things should we fund next, especially at the cost of other things? Yes, if you're like, we want all the things, and yeah, that isn't the true question, but it's, we have this limited amount of funds to give out in this period, and what is sufficiently important for this community to fund next? And then the final canonical design element is, how do you change secondary rules in the first place, aka amendment rules? And I've argued that, ultimately protocol upgrades on blockchain networks can be understood as a form of amendment, precisely because protocols specify those with concentrated governance incentives and constrain those validators' incentives on behalf of a broader class of users. That may be more than you expected, but academics are good at that.
So the idea of this ZuVillage or of the protocol design altogether was to deal in the longer run with exactly these problems, to never let political fighting over something that does not need to be declared a body of governance ever arise. And it is, however, not always available that you don't have exit costs. But what can we take as a lesson for that? If I want to now take the inspiration from ZuVillage, pull it in a precise direction that I think is promising, but aside of that, I don't want the same infighting. I don't want the loss of efficiency because political groups or interest groups or fractions within that direction form and use the energy of fighting each other instead of building new stuff that can work into this direction. On what levels should I avoid declaring governance or declaring any kind of body of governance, and how can I how can I stay open in that sense without losing the essence of the direction? Because this might also be very important for other ZuVillage directions like Vitalia or Edge City that also have a series of events and they are governed in a similar way and they have a different direction that they also cannot afford to lose.
So, to me, you probably asked $1 trillion question in terms of the extent to which how do we prevent the inevitable emergence of faction within, and especially, I'm glad you've been listening, you concentrate governance authority, you constitute the thing, and you create the kind of the breeding ground for the emergence of interests. That being said, as I noted, not constituting the thing has trade-offs. And so the extent to which voluntary contributors continue to show up is an important metric by which you're actually defining a sufficiently coherent valence of animating principles for the community. That is, to me, the only way without formally constituting and having some periodic input from among voters that you'll be able to perceive outcomes. That being said, I also emphasize the extent to which it's a trade-off, not a inherently, in all cases, superior decision not to constitute the thing. That being said, boy, do I love competitive governance. And so I've also attended, Edge City events. And I guess one benefit to having contributed to constitutional design processes around the world is I tend to be agnostic past a certain level about the rightness or wrongness of decisions being made in a given context. And one hugely beneficial constraint in practice is different options competing for people's scarce resources, whether it be attention, whether it be capital, whether it be them traveling around the world to this location versus this location, is you're constrained by the choices of your competitors, even as you're also constrained by the success of your own decisions in furtherance of a particular purpose or animating set of principles or valence, as I've called it in this particular context. And so for me, the existence of these other experiments, and I think that that's part of what I find fascinating, is I think that this is an innovation in community organization, although the extent to which you formally organize and, dare I say, constitute the thing is a very fascinating question in its own right. And to my understanding, some of these other communities have more formally constituted themselves relative to those I've found here. And so for me, the proof may be in the pudding, in the sense of, choices of one versus choices of another, and the ability to successfully draw contributors is how I would say I would assess the ultimate success after the fact. But doing so in a predictive sense is, I'd point you to all of my work on complexity theory and Knightian uncertainty, which is, boy, is our foresight in complex human associations limited. And so if I could answer that question for you right now, I would love to make some strategic investments as a result of that, simply because if I have perfect downstream information, I could beat the markets every time. But I'm saying, to be very clear, my foresight is as limited as anyone, and so the only thing I would point to is the benefits of competitive discipline between these different pop-up villages.
Is this happening over the ability to fork with relatively low exit costs? Because that's at least is my interpretation of capture resistance for this year. Whoever is inspired by the thing that your talk right now can create its own experiment. We need the experiments because we are not so knowledgeable how that turns out in the longer run over complexity science. And what is also a really valuable input from you, I think, is that votes in a democratic voting seldomly represent actual interests, actual skin in the game of the ones voting, but rather interest groups, fractions, and so on. In what way can we, and this is might be a bit an overshoot into the next talk, what way does it make sense to take this kind of oversimplification, one person votes for party A or party B, and not only break it down into 10 different categories of A and B, but let it fluently happen in depth, nuance, and also invested time and
So many things you said, but a couple I want to pull out. One, exit costs. If they're sufficiently low, that does beneficially constrain the governance choices of any concentrated authority within that ecosystem. And I think the threat of forking is credible in certain contexts. Soft forking, especially vis-a-vis the animating principles of these communities, versus hard forking. Because to me, hard forking has been diminishing among the well-capitalized cryptocurrency networks precisely because I view it as ultimately cannibalizing the network effects that these networks' animating principles so integrally rely upon. And so at some point, past a certain point, the threat of forking diminishes precisely because those who are in the losing fork, dare I say Ethereum Classic, are ultimately, much less successful than the one that truly actually commands enough of the community's attention, voluntary input, resources, you name it. And so, that being said, I also think sidebar stablecoin issuers have a very frightening veto power over most hard forks because they are not going to duplicate the token holdings in stablecoins into a new fork. And so they are effectively a kingmaker for hard forks. But I do think that another canonical constitutional design solution is already emergent, certainly in the Ethereum ecosystem, which is that of subsidiary units that enable greater tailoring and greater institutional diversity and variation. I'm talking about L2s. And so they all exist under the L1's constitutional structure, even as the specific purposes that people are using any one L2 are, varying. That being said, I did ask a question in the L2 session, which surrounded the trade-offs between interoperability and scaling benefits on L2s. The more variation in uses that you're seeing on L2s, the less that they will actually be able to fully kind of talk to one another and seamlessly interoperate. Although I'm certainly not technically sophisticated, referring back to my arguments about the benefits of specialization in organizational decision-making. That being said, I do view that as an emergent solution, which is if you have a particular desired feature set, you should probably be looking for that on a given L2, and that prevents some measure of, dare I say, special interest lobbying on the main layer, which is if your needs can be accommodated in a subsidiary unit, you don't need to change every aspect of the system in its entirety to accommodate those subsidiary preferences. Of course, there are trade-offs to this, though, as I've already noted. And John, you had a question.
My thoughts moved on slightly, but I was just reflecting on the complete absence of the word accountability in this talk, and it seems that it's one of the constraining principles over a healthier form of democracy is when we have the ability to hold any animating principles, the governance structures themselves, and the people in positions of authority accountable, and accountable to whom. It's not a reflection on Zoo at all. It's just a general democratic sort of architectural feature. And I was wondering whether the lack isn't a reflection on democracy at all. It's rather it's identifying the inequivalency of the Zoo project and democracies or political systems as a whole. I mean, none of us have to worry about a Lord of the Flies situation here. The toilets are flushing, the water is flowing, the breakfast is kind of delivered by people who deliver it. And it just seems that this is much more like a board or a special interest group than it is like a political system or a political structure at all. And I wonder whether there's a number of lessons to be learned from more or less successful democratic processes, but we can't really infer anything about the nature of democracy or the rightness of voting in particular ways from the successful failure of the Zoo project, because this is a really complicated project. It's value behind, and it is a very interestingly artificial situation, therefore. So I think that's been my reflection rather than the question I originally had, which was why there's a complete lack of worry, essentially, about accountability in this particular context and what that means for understanding this as a political project.
We've been dancing around that question, which is if people can exit, that is its own form of accountability.
Right.
But I'm glad you made this point because it gives me the ability to, dare I say, shill my own work, which is a piece I'll be presenting in Paris entitled An Organizational Codes Theorem, Constitutional Constraints as Increasing in Exit Costs. And so to me, the reason that public democratic orders tend to outperform dictatorships, especially repressive dictatorships, is that they have constitutional constraints that enable accountability. And so one of them is periodic democratic input into those who are making concentrated decisions on their behalfs, whether it be legislators, whether it be, the executive, or this is the argument about maybe we actually want term limits on the Supreme Court in the United States, because boy, do they not seem accountable from some people's perspectives in ways that is delegitimizing the perspective of the court itself. And so to me, ultimately, the less that people can exit, the greater the benefits from accountability mechanisms, as I suspect you would deem them. But given that we are at time, I suspect that is the substance of another talk in its entirety.
Should we continue this discussion a little bit, or do we want to continue with the pensive instead?
We use the bathroom.
Maybe 5 minutes break room.
Do you want to continue, or do you?
I mean, if there's more questions, I talked for 3 hours with Kyle. Flick me and I will produce words about governance.
Just maybe a one-on-one chat that we can
May I ask a question, please? Ask a question.
Well, I guess I'm just ruminating right now about contract law and how that's so much different than constitutional law, and I'm just trying to kind of reconcile the two. So contract is a one-to-one relationship, but the thing that I find really interesting about it is it's like computationally irreducible in that there's 3 elements of contract, and if you meet those, then you can create a legal relationship with everyone else. Whereas in constitutional, it's like this big framework, and it's just it's very top-down. Whereas contract is much more grassroots and bubble up. And so, and then I'm thinking about John Hillis's duocracy and how that's different than democracy. So the entrepreneurial spirit. So that's why I think you and I need to have a conversation first. But these are the key words.
So my thoughts on contracts as distinguishable from constitutional ordering is simply that it's an interesting question what private contract law would look like absent a common law, which is the jurisdictions I'm most familiar with, backdrop saying this is actually how we will enforce all the undefined spaces of contracts. But if we view common law's definition of contracts, how they say these canonical elements create a binding contract, to me what's fascinating about contract law is the emergence of standardized terms and standardized expectations that the courts will apply, governing the voluntary choices of those who have bound themselves to a sufficiently definable contractual commitment. And to me, the emergence of standardized terms that are likely to apply in all instances, I'm evoking smart contracts deliberately with my choice of language here. And so for me, there are very interesting elements, but smart contracts enforcement is only viable given a sufficiently well-specified and constitutionally constrained validator set on a given blockchain network. And so this is part of why I have likened a blockchain protocol to be a form of nascent private constitutional ordering, because then once you have a sufficiently actually beneficially constrained powerful group, then the certainty that your smart contractual terms will execute as specified is much larger, and people will voluntarily bind themselves to it. And so the analogy I'm drawing is a good blockchain protocol enables the emergence of a much larger set of voluntary economic commitments therein. But perhaps we can continue this conversation at another session. One last question, all right.
I missed the talk, but I wanted to come. Are there any sources, literature, books you recommend to get up to speed on the topics discussed?
We can post them in Element afterwards.
Yeah, I'll post some, but I also was gesturing broadly at entire fields of the political economy literature, and that's a 40-year field with its own journal dedicated to it. And I'm not so self-interested that I'll simply shill my own papers, but the application of many of these insights to digital governance contexts that is the largest component of my research agenda, but let's absolutely talk further.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.